Now, if you're in the same situation as me, this game wound up in your library one day and you have no idea how it got there. No, not that game. We all know that's there for research purposes. I'm talking about Al-Qadim, the Genie's Curse. Published by SSI, who were responsible for the release of many a 90s D&D title, it was developed by Cyberlore Studios, the most of which I can say about them being that they made a Warcraft expansion down the line. If you're like me, that Al-Qadim is a campaign setting comes as something of a surprise. It was essentially a limited run, debuting in 1992 and being all but finished by the end of '94. Taking place in Zakara, also called the Land of Fate, Al-Qadim makes heavy use of Arabic themes, prominently featuring many elements from Arabian Nights, a collection of Islamic folklore and stories. I mean, they weren't exactly being subtle about it. One of the first source books released was entitled Arabian Adventures, and yes, that is the same artwork that they use for this game. Stylistically, Al-Qadim is likely closest to Dark Sun, which you might be a bit more familiar with, mainly in the sense of sand. There's goddamn sand everywhere. Granted, it's decidedly lacking in the apocalyptic elements found in Dark Sun. By comparison, Al-Qadim is like living in paradise, but from a strictly visual standpoint, they are somewhat similar. Ironically, Al-Qadim is actually part of the Forgotten Realms, but it's incredibly far from anywhere in Faerun, and pretty hard to actually get to. The Genie's Curse sees you traverse the Land of Fate as this fine gentleman here, a young corsair and the husband-to-be of the Grand Caliph's daughter. But, because this was the 90s, a series of unfortunate events results in the disappearance of your betrothed and sees your family implicated in the ensuing fallout, which means that it's up to you to save your wife, your family, and, the world, because what's one more chore tacked onto the honey-do list? In stark contrast to pretty much every other D&D game from the DOS era, the Genie's Curse really isn't an RPG. It plays much more closely to that of an adventure game, presented in a top-down perspective with a strong emphasis on puzzle solving. There is combat, with the game taking every opportunity to throw groups of enemies at you, but the associated systems are very streamlined in what is a decidedly actionized adaptation. It might be different, especially from the Gold Box games, but more importantly, is it good? Well, all in all, it kinda depends. I'll explain. To rip the band-aid off to start with, this isn't a D&D game, at least not from a gameplay standpoint. It claims to make use of 2nd edition AD&D, but it's really nowhere to be found. Outside of spell and item names, along with a few enemies, none of the gameplay elements that you would come to expect from the rule set are present. This, no doubt, has a lot to do with how combat is actually presented, being real-time as opposed to turn-based. Your character does have stats, and some pretty damn good ones, I might add. Buddy just casually rolled a 94 with a great strength modifier, but they don't actually mean anything. Nor do you get any say in how you handle combat. There is no character creation, so to speak, with everything except your name being predetermined. When it comes time to throw down, you run at enemies, swing at them with your sword, maybe cast a spell if you're feeling particularly frisky, and then rinse and repeat. Enemies often do much the same, leading to this weird dance as you do your damnedest not to get hit. There's really no progression either. Occasionally the game will decide that you've progressed far enough along in the story to let you find an equipment upgrade, but again, like your stats, it has little impact. It does make you stronger, letting you deal more and take a bit less damage, but the gameplay remains the same otherwise. The most you get is a few different ways to swing your sword, which are learned by having a duel with this guy. This is one hell of a teaching method, I gotta admit. Unfortunately, that's the case for the entire game. This incredibly bare-bones carpal tunnel simulator is all you get. Not to mention, it's oddly incompetent at times. Enemies will often just stare at you as you pelt them with bullets from your sling, which is so magical that it never runs out of ammo and homes onto enemies. It's almost like the developers knew that aiming spells was a complete pain in the ass. Experience can oftentimes be outright bought by talking to the right person, and boy, you better not go into any dungeon without a Brinks truck worth of healing potions on hand. They're the only way to heal outside of 2 instant heal MacGuffins found in the overworld, and with combat this clunky, you're going to take a beating. All of this leaves you with what is effectively a watered-down Mystic Quest, which, considering Mystic Quest was already a watered-down Final Fantasy, is saying something. It isn't really helped by the fact that its age shows in some places. There's no quick swapping between the bounty of items and weapons that you'll collect, forcing you to menu every time you want to make a change, and some of the sections that rely on stealth can feel entirely unfair, because you can't see all that far in the view window, meaning that you'll undoubtedly run yourself into someone without having the chance to even know that they're there. Also, there's no overly dramatic and detailed death animation, which I feel like is typically par for the course in these older games. The end screen is cool though. My guy just is the entire sky. All of this is a shame because everything else about this game is actually pretty good. Definitely better than I thought it would be at first glance. The puzzles, usually found in one of the many dungeons you'll get to delve into, are engaging and just outright fun. And they're fun because, unlike the puzzles of many a DOS game from the same era, they make sense and give you more than enough of an idea of what is expected in order to solve them. I know it sounds dumb, but the fact that they don't rely on insane moon logic makes them that much more fun to figure out. They're based more in trial and error and usually encompass the entirety of an area you might be exploring. It's like the dungeon itself is the puzzle, being completed once you reach the end. The soundtrack is a nice mix between ambiance and suspense. There aren't really any huge bombastic tracks that demand your attention, but they work incredibly well with the backdrops they're set against. I was a particular fan of everything that played while you're on your ship, whether it be while you're just chilling by your lonesome, or fending off an unwelcome boarding from some pirates. As if everything that's been on screen to this point wasn't proof enough, the game looks good. The pixel art on display is top-notch, colors pop, and the sprite work is expressive with a lot of depth and character. Look at this scene of the sailing boat, man. It didn't matter how often it played, I loved it every time. Just a joy to look at. And the cliched story is handled well. I mean, that doesn't excuse the fact that it's as vanilla as can be. I basically described the whole thing in the opener, but its execution is well done. In particular, the dialogue, of which there is no shortage of, has quite a bit of personality. You almost get the feeling that the writers were aware that they hadn't exactly crafted a masterpiece and chose to lean into that fact. Dialogue options chew the scenery, there's a lot of lampshade hanging, and just enough absurdity to be fun without shattering the spirit of the world. The scene where you smuggle a Cyclops through the royal palace is stupid, and I love every part of it. Now, I'm not an Al-Qadim expert, and I'd be willing to bet that there are likely very few, if any, to be found in the world, but if the wiki crash course that I gave myself before playing this game is any indication, then the Genie's Curse appears to be a pretty faithful representation of the source material. Some of the most prevalent themes in the setting are that of honor, generosity, and piety, to say nothing of the unique class kits that can be used as additional descriptors for the background of characters. Yes, your title of Corsair actually has meaning beyond sounding really cool. And as a newly minted Corsair of noble birth, you're largely expected to act as honorably as the world and title would deem necessary. The sarcastic dialogue options, as good for a chuckle as they may be, usually won't get you very far. Genies and Jinn, cruel and dismissive, are to be treated with reverence in respect to their great power. This is not a world with a lot of gray area. What is right and wrong is pretty well defined, and that's because there isn't much strife in Zakara. The races largely live in peace with each other with a strong belief in fate spread across society. And overall, I thought the Genie's Curse did a much better job showing all of this off through the dialogue, the areas you explore, and yes, even the narrative, than most other games from the time. Heck, I think there could be an argument made that this is one of the better representations of a campaign setting in a D&D game, period. It's just frustrating to me that they didn't lean more heavily into these aspects. Think about it, have we ever gotten a D&D game that was more about the world than the gameplay? I can't think of any off the top of my head, and this game would have been the perfect opportunity to just say, you know what, screw the combat, throw out the monster manual, and let's just focus on the environment that this all takes place in. Imagine if back when campaign worlds were pumped out at an ungodly rate, that they also came with an accompanying video game that helped you to learn about and visualize the world. That would have been so cool that I almost can't think of words to describe it. If the Genie's Curse had just been a proper adventure game, I think it would have been far better. I wanted more of the world and less of waving my sword around, and it's hard to play through it without feeling like the attention paid to the latter was stealing something from the former. That, my friends, is what makes this game so difficult to judge. From a gameplay standpoint, it's outright boring. one-dimensional, and cumbersome. Yet, it's a very good representation of the world, making use of several written elements in order to enhance its atmosphere. I think what you're liable to get out of this game depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for traditional D&D gameplay and combat, you'll likely be disappointed. If you want to dive into and explore a world, especially a niche one, then you'll probably love it. For me, it fell somewhere between those two extremes. I certainly don't think this is a bad game by any means, just a bit misguided, and maybe even a bit unaware of what it does well. Still, it's not all that long of a title, and if it's already in your library like I expect it might be for many a classic D&D fan, I can't really find much reason to advise against giving it a try.